The sky over the Dust Bowl wasn't falling, it was exploding. Mortar rounds were turning the tarmac into a graveyard, and the only Apache left wasn't piloted by a Top Gun. It was being held together by a woman with grease under her fingernails and a rejection letter in her pocket. As the base commander looks into the eyes of a mechanic and hands her the keys to a flying tank, you have to ask yourself, if the world was burning, would you trust a ghost to save you? The sky over Outpost Zero wasn't weather. It was a rhythmic, soul-crushing percussion of outgoing and incoming steel. The air didn't just carry the scent of rain. It carried the metallic tang of ionized air and the thick, choking grit of pulverized concrete. Every few seconds the earth would heave, a violent shudder that traveled from the soles of a soldier's boots directly into the marrow of their bones. Inside the primary hangar, the atmosphere was suffocating. It wasn't just the heat of the desert trapped under corrugated tin. It was the smell of cold sweat and the high-pitched whine of machinery pushed past its breaking point. Sergeant Gray Thorne stood in the shadow of a damaged airframe. Her hands, stained so deeply with hydraulic fluid they looked like charcoal, tightening around a heavy pneumatic wrench. Her breathing was shallow, a conscious effort to filter out the dust that coated every surface in a fine, gray shroud. To her left, a row of mechanics ducked instinctively as another mortar round slammed into the perimeter, the shockwave rattling the hangar's metal ribs like a predator trying to claw its way inside. Think about the weight of that silence in between the explosions. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's the kind of silence that demands a sacrifice. The heavy steel doors of the hangar groaned open, admitting a slice of blinding orange-tinted sunlight and a panicked lieutenant colonel. His face was a mask of soot, his jaw set so tight the muscles pulsed visibly. He didn't look for a rank, he looked for a miracle. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the rows of grounded, broken birds. "We have a convoy being liquidated at the Three-Finger Pass," the colonel shouted, his voice cracking through the roar of distant sirens. 44 souls are pinned down, and we're losing the gate. I need a pilot, now." The hangar, usually a symphony of clanking tools and shouting crews, went utterly still. The mechanics stayed hunched over their work, eyes fixed on the floor, their knuckles turning white as they gripped their wrenches. They knew the truth. The two active-duty pilots on base were already gone. One in the infirmary, the other lost when the first wave hit the tarmac. What would you do in that silence? Would you look at your hands and see tools, or would you see a lifeline? The colonel's gaze moved from man to man, finding only the hollow stare of the exhausted. He looked at the last remaining Valkyrie. 7. 4. The Apache that Gray had spent the last 36 hours rebuilding piece by agonizing piece. It was the only machine on the base that wasn't currently a smoking ruin, but it was a ghost ship. A weapon without a hand to wield it. Gray felt a strange, cold vibration in her chest. It wasn't the mortars. It was a phantom memory, the sensation of a flight stick in her palm from a decade ago, guided by a father whose wings had eventually failed him. She remembered the rejection letter from flight school, the one that said her vision wasn't perfect enough for the cockpit. She had spent years proving them wrong by becoming the best surgeon these machines ever had, but she was still just maintenance. She took a step forward. Her boots crunched on the sand-dusted floor. "I can fly it," she said. The words were small, but they hit the room with more force than the artillery outside. Heads snapped toward her. The colonel froze, his hand hovering near his holster as if he were facing a threat he didn't understand. He looked at her sweat-stained cap, the grease smeared across her cheekbones, and the raw, calloused state of her hands. "Your repair crew, Sergeant," the colonel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low rumble. "You aren't flight certified. You don't have the hours. You don't have the clearance." Gray didn't flinch. She felt the heat of the hangar pressing in on her, but her internal temperature had plummeted to 0. "With all due respect, sir, the certified pilots are dead or bleeding out. I built that bird. I know the torque tolerances of every bolt in the rotor assembly. I know its soul. If you want those 44 men to see tomorrow, you don't need a certificate. You need someone who knows how to make that machine breathe." Another explosion rocked the base, closer this time. A piece of shrapnel tore through the hangar roof, whistling like a banshee before embedding itself in a nearby crate. The colonel looked at the burning horizon, then back at the woman standing before him. He was torn between 1,000 pages of military regulation and the brutal reality of the blood being spilled 5 miles away. This wasn't a choice. It was a gamble with the lives he didn't own. The air in the hangar seemed to thin, leaving everyone gasping. The colonel's eyes searched hers for a flicker of doubt, a tremor of fear, anything that would give him an excuse to say no. He found nothing but a steady, grim resolve. The commander's hand hesitated on his holster, his fingers twitching against the leather as he weighed the court-martial against the massacre. Finally, his face hardened into a mask of desperate pragmatism. He leaned in close, the smell of cordite and desperation rolling off him. "Get it airborne," he shouted, his voice barely a whisper against the chaos. Gray didn't wait for a second command. She turned and began a dead sprint toward the Valkyrie, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But as she reached the side of the cockpit, the colonel's hand gripped her shoulder, spinning her back for one last second. His eyes were dark, filled with the weight of a man who knew he might be sending a ghost to its second death. "If you go up there, Sergeant, there is no coming back down to your old life. Do you understand?" Gray didn't answer. She climbed. "Would you have pulled the trigger on that decision?" The commander's hand stayed on his sidearm, watching her disappear into the cockpit, his heart racing as he realized he'd either just saved his men or authorized a suicide mission. The canopy of the Valkyrie 7-4 hissed shut, sealing Sergeant Gray Thorne into a world of high-definition glass and the smell of ozone. Outside, the hangar was a blur of frantic motion and rising smoke, but inside the cockpit, the air was unnervingly recycled and cool. Her calloused fingers, still stained with the dark grease of the morning's repair work, danced across the console with a muscle memory that defied her lack of a pilot's wings. Think about the sensory overload. To a mechanic, every switch is a physical connection to a hydraulic line or a circuit board. To a pilot, it's a command. Gray was both, and the duality was paralyzing. The turbines began their low-frequency moan, building into a scream that vibrated through the floorboards and into her teeth. She didn't look at a checklist. She looked through the machine. She could feel the fuel flow regulators opening, the igniters sparking, and the transmission gears biting into one another. The HUD flickered to life, a ghostly green projection that painted the chaotic world outside in cold mathematical lines. In the corner of the glass, she saw the battery levels and torque percentages climb. What would you do when the machine starts to breathe with you? Is it a partner, or is it a predator waiting for you to make a mistake? The first mortar hit 50 yards from the hangar doors, sent a shower of red-hot shrapnel shrieking against the Valkyrie's armored skin. The helicopter rocked on its skids. Gray's breathing hitched, her lungs feeling like they were filled with lead. She reached into the pocket of her flight suit and pulled out a small, crinkled photograph, a man with the same stubborn jawline standing beside a vintage Huey. She pressed it against the dash, a silent prayer to a ghost, before her hand clamped onto the cyclic. The lurch was violent. The Valkyrie didn't lift so much as it fought the earth. The nose dipped, the tail rotor overcorrected with a high-pitched snarl, and for a terrifying heartbeat, the 4-ton machine threatened to roll and turn the hangar into a funeral pyre. Gray's knuckles were white, the skin stretching tight over her joints as she fought the gyroscopic forces. Her vision blurred for a second. That 3/4 diopter deficit in her left eye choosing the worst possible moment to manifest as a shadow in her periphery. She forced her eyes wide, sweat stinging the corners of her lids. She didn't fly by the instruments. She flew by the vibration in her seat. She felt the moment the lift exceeded the weight, the moment the Valkyrie stopped being a pile of metal and became a creature of the air. With a guttural roar of the engines, the Apache cleared the hangar roof, banking hard into a sky that was the color of a fresh bruise. Think about the pressure on her spine as the G-forces climbed. This wasn't the smooth, sterile environment of a simulator. This was a vibrating, screaming cockpit where every gust of wind felt like a punch to the ribs. As she cleared the base perimeter, the scale of the disaster unfolded beneath her. The ember ridges were alive with tracer fire, long ribbons of red light reaching up from the shadows of the valley. The radio crackled to life, a burst of static that eventually resolved into the colonel's voice, tight with a mixture of awe and terror. "Grease 1, this is Outpost Command. You are clear of the wire. We have eyes on the target. Stay low, stay fast. And Sergeant, try to stay alive." Gray didn't reply. She couldn't. Her entire universe had shrunk to the size of the HUD and the feeling of the pedals beneath her boots. She pushed the nose down, trading altitude for airspeed, the desert floor becoming a brown smear just 30 feet below her sensors. The speed was intoxicating, a sudden, violent freedom that her father had described and the Army had denied her. But that freedom came with a price. The three-finger pass loomed ahead, a narrow, jagged throat of rock where the convoy was trapped. She could see the smoke now, black and oily, rising from a lead vehicle that had been turned into a scorched skeleton. The soldiers on the ground were tiny, desperate shadows huddling behind rusted metal, pinned down by a force they couldn't see. Gray's finger hovered over the weapons release. The targeting computer began its rhythmic, electronic chirping, trying to lock onto the heat signatures of the enemy technicals hidden in the crags. Her heart was a drum, her breath a jagged rasp in the headset. Then, the world turned red. A piercing, continuous shriek filled the cockpit, a sound that every pilot hears in their nightmares. On the HUD, a flashing diamond appeared, centered on her own aircraft. It was a missile lock, high intensity, ground-based, and closing fast. Gray had barely cleared the base, had barely learned how to hover, and now a heat-seeking predator was screaming through the air to erase her from the sky. The alarm was a physical blow to her senses. Her mind raced through the schematics of the flares, the countermeasure dispensers, the manual overrides. She was no longer just a mechanic. She was a target. The missile lock warning transitioned from a chirp to a solid, deathly hum. The solid, deathly hum of the missile lock vibrated through the Valkyrie's airframe, a sound that bypassed the ears and settled directly into the stomach. Inside the cockpit, the lighting shifted to a frantic, strobing amber. Sergeant Graythorne felt the cold realization of her own mortality wash over her like ice water. She wasn't a pilot who had spent hundreds of hours in a simulator practicing evasion. She was a mechanic who knew exactly what a high-explosive warhead would do to the titanium rotors she had polished just hours ago. Think about the compression of time. In a crisis, a second isn't a measurement, it's a chasm. How do you choose which way to jump when you've never been taught to leap? Her hand slammed the countermeasure switch, a button she had replaced 3 months ago during a routine overhaul. A cluster of magnesium flares erupted from the side pods, blooming behind the tail like miniature suns. Gray yanked the cyclic hard to the right, a maneuver so violent the airframe groaned in protest, the metal screaming under the sudden G-load. A white streak of fire hissed past the canopy, so close the heat momentarily clouded the glass. The explosion erupted 50 yards out, the shockwave tossing the 4-ton Apache like a leaf in a gale. Gray's lungs burned, her breath coming in short, jagged rasps that fogged the inside of her helmet. She didn't have time to recover. Below her, The Three-Finger Pass was a slaughterhouse. Through the green-tinted night vision of the HUD, she saw the trapped convoy. 5 vehicles were huddled in the throat of the canyon, their tires shredded, their hulls pockmarked by heavy machine gun fire. She could see the heat signatures of the soldiers, small, flickering ghosts huddled in the dirt, pinned by an enemy that held the high ground. The moral weight of the moment began to press down harder than the atmospheric pressure. At what point does a soldier stop being a technician and start being a reaper? The targeting computer painted a series of red boxes on the crags above the pass. Technicals, pickup trucks mounted with heavy Soviet-era guns, were raining fire down on the trapped men. Gray's thumb hovered over the red trigger on the cyclic. She had spent her career keeping machines alive, nursing engines back from the brink of failure. Now, the machine was demanding she use it to take life. Her knuckles were white, the skin over her joints stretched so thin it looked transparent. She felt the vibration of the 30mm chain gun beneath her feet, a hungry, idling beast. She dived. The desert floor rushed up to meet her, a blur of jagged rock and shadow. She lined up the cursor, centering the breathing of her own lungs with the sway of the aircraft. Squeeze. The Valkyrie shuddered as the chain gun spat a stream of tungsten shells. The sound wasn't like a gun. It was like the earth itself was being unzipped. On the ridge, the lead technical vanished in a blossom of fire and spinning debris. Gray didn't celebrate. She felt a sickening lurch in her gut, the weight of an irreversible choice. But as the radio erupted with the frantic, sobbing cheers of the men in the dirt below, the hesitation vanished. This wasn't about the manual anymore. This was about the math of survival. "Grease 1! You're hitting them! Keep it up!" the radio screamed, the voice of a young private breaking under the strain of the combat. "They're moving in on our left flank. We're out of ammo." Gray banked hard, the rotors biting into the thin, hot air with a rhythmic thwack-thwack that felt like a heartbeat. She unleashed a salvo of Hydra rockets, the white trails stitching the darkness, turning the enemy's high ground advantage into a crumbling wall of fire. She was no longer just flying. She was weaving a protective shroud over the men below. The Apache moved with her, responding to her calloused touch as if it recognized the hands that had rebuilt its heart. But the geometry of defiance has a breaking point. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were adapting. As Gray swung around for a third pass, a jagged flash of light erupted from a hidden crevice in the rocks. It wasn't a missile this time. It was a concentrated burst from a heavy anti-aircraft cannon. The rounds chewed through the air, traveling faster than sound. Clang, clink, shriek. The sound of metal on metal was deafening. The Valkyrie lurched violently to the left. The control stick began to fight her, vibrating with a frantic, erratic life of its own. On the HUD, a new set of warnings began to blink. Not amber, but a deep, pulsing blood red. The oil pressure in the tail rotor drive was plummeting. The hydraulics were bleeding out into the desert sand. Think about the silence of a failing machine. It's the sound of a promise being broken. The aircraft began to yaw, the nose sliding uncontrollably toward the canyon wall. Gray fought the pedals, her boots slipping on the metal as she tried to kick the bird back into alignment. The smell of burning, scorched wire and hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit, thick and suffocating. She looked at the photo of her father on the dash. The glass was cracked now, a jagged line running right through his smile. "Outpost Command, this is Grease 1, she gasped, her voice sounding small against the roar of the failing engines. "I've taken heavy fire to the tail assembly, losing stability." The colonel's voice came back instantly, stripped of all authority, leaving only a raw, jagged edge of panic. "Grease 1, abort! Break contact and return to base immediately. That is a direct order. The bird is going to come apart." Gray looked down at the canyon. The convoy was starting to move, the soldiers scrambling into the surviving trucks, but the enemy was already repositioning for one final, lethal ambush at the exit of the pass. If she left now, she would be safe. But 44 men would be erased before the sun hit the horizon. She looked at the red, blinking lights, then at the soldiers below. Her hand didn't move toward the retreat vector. Instead, she gripped the cyclic even tighter, her fingers locking into place. "Negative, Command," she whispered into the static. "I'm not done yet." Just as she pushed the nose down for one last, desperate run, a massive jolt rocked the entire frame. A heavy, grinding screech echoed from the rear of the helicopter, the sound of the tail rotor gearbox finally surrendering to the shrapnel. The Valkyrie began a slow, sickening spin, the horizon tilting at an impossible angle. The centrifugal force slammed Sergeant Graythorne's head against the canopy glass as the Valkyrie began its sickening, uncompensated yaw. The screech of the tail rotor gearbox, a sound like 1,000 serrated knives dragging across a chalkboard, drowned out the wind. Inside the cockpit, the world had become a kaleidoscope of brown earth and bruised sky, spinning with a rhythmic, mechanical violence. Think about the sheer physics of failure. When the tail rotor of an Apache dies, the fuselage wants to spin in the opposite direction of the main blades. It is a mathematical certainty of disaster. How do you maintain your resolve when the very laws of motion are trying to tear your body apart? Gray's boots fought the rudder pedals, but they felt like they were connected to nothing but air. The hydraulic fluid was gone, leaving a trail of iridescent purple mist across the desert floor. On the HUD, the altitude readout was plummeting. 200 feet, 150, 100. The colonel's voice was a frantic, distorted crackle in her ear, demanding she punch out, demanding she save herself. But Gray wasn't listening to the radio. She was listening to the machine. She knew that if she ejected now, 4 tons of uncontrolled titanium and high explosives would tumble directly into the center of the retreating convoy. "Negative, Command," she rasped, the words thick with the copper taste of a bitten lip. "I'm staying with her." She did the only thing the manual didn't recommend. She cut the collective and let the aircraft drop. By reducing the pitch of the main blades, she momentarily killed the torque that was causing the spin. For a heartbeat, the Valkyrie stopped rotating and fell like a stone. It was a dead-stick gamble. In that terrifying window of linear flight, she lined up the nose with the exit of the pass, where the final enemy ambush was setting up a kill zone. Imagine the silence in that cockpit for those 3 seconds of freefall. No engine roar, no wind, just the sound of your own heartbeat hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. Would you have the clarity to aim while you were falling? At 50 feet above the jagged rocks, Gray yanked the collective back up. The transmission groaned, a deep, metallic sob that vibrated through her spine, but the rotors bit the air one last time. The Valkyrie flared, its nose pitching up as she unleashed every remaining Hydra rocket in a single, desperate salvo. The canyon exit erupted in a wall of white phosphorus and orange flame, a corridor of fire that scorched the path clean for the fleeing soldiers. The radio erupted. It wasn't the colonel this time. It was the men on the ground. A chorus of raw, jagged cheers reached through the static. Men who had been resigned to a shallow grave now seeing a path to the horizon. But Gray couldn't answer them. The strain of the flare-out had been the final straw for the damaged airframe. A heavy thud echoed from the engine compartment as the left turbine surged and then died, choked by its own shrapnel. The vibrations became bone-jarring, blurring Gray's vision. The instrument panel was a Christmas tree of red warnings. The smell of electrical fire, that sharp, stinging scent of melting plastic filled the small cabin. "Grease 1! Your status!" the colonel barked, his voice no longer commanding but pleading. Gray looked at the photo of her father. The jagged crack in the glass made it look like he was fading into a mist. She realized then that she hadn't just been flying to save the men below. She had been flying to finish a conversation that ended when she was 12 years old. She had proven she could hunt. She had proven she could lead. Now she had to prove she could survive the landing. The base was 5 miles away. The Valkyrie was flying on a single, wounded engine and a prayer. Every input on the cyclic felt like levering a ton of lead. The tail was dragging, the nose was hunting, and the vibrations were so intense that the rivets in the cockpit floor were starting to pop like champagne corks. Think about the psychological weight of the return trip. The adrenaline is gone, replaced by the cold, hard realization of what you've done and what it's going to cost you. The desert floor rolled beneath her, a patchwork of shadows and burned scrub. The lights of Outpost Zero appeared on the horizon, a tiny, flickering island of safety in a sea of hostile dark. But as she approached the perimeter, the final engine gave a wet, grinding cough. The RPM gauge dropped into the black. The Valkyrie didn't glide. It surrendered. "Mayday, Mayday," Gray whispered, her voice surprisingly calm as the cockpit lights flickered and died, leaving her in the ghostly green glow of the emergency HUD. "Losing all power. Going in hard." The base threw itself forward. She saw the hangar doors, the huddle of mechanics shielding their eyes, the colonel standing on the edge of the tarmac with his hands over his ears. She pulled back on the stick, trying to use the last bit of rotor inertia to cushion the impact. But the Valkyrie had nothing left to give. The ground rushed up, not as a surface, but as a weapon. The skids hit the scorched concrete with a sound like a freight train hitting a mountain. The frame shrieked, the glass shattered, and then darkness. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the hiss of escaping steam. The rescuers were sprinting towards the wreck, fire extinguishers in hand, but the colonel stopped 10 feet away. He watched as the crumpled door of the Valkyrie groaned on its hinges. The silence following the crash was more violent than the impact itself. It was a thick, ringing void, punctuated only by the rhythmic tink, tink, tink of cooling titanium and the hiss of fire-suppressant foam spreading across the scorched concrete. Inside the shattered cockpit of Valkyrie 7, 4, Sergeant Gray Thorne felt the world returning in jagged fragments. The taste of copper in her mouth, the smell of burnt electrical insulation, and the weight of a body that felt as though it had been fused to the pilot's seat. Think about the weight of that first breath after a disaster. It's the moment you realize you aren't a ghost, but a survivor with a debt to pay. What would be your first thought in that stillness? A gloved hand appeared through the spiderweb of cracks in the canopy glass. The outer latch groaned, complaining against the warped frame before the door was wrenched open by a team of first responders. The desert wind rushed in, carrying the scent of smoke and the distant, fading echo of artillery. They pulled Gray from the wreckage, her legs feeling like water, her vision swimming in a sea of gray and gold. As her boots touched the tarmac, she didn't look at the medics. She looked back at the machine. The tail was gone. The rotors were twisted into grotesque metal ribbons, and the fuselage was pockmarked with the scars of a battle it was never supposed to fight. The colonel stood 10 feet away, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. He didn't move toward her. He didn't offer a hand. He watched her with a gaze that was unreadable, a mixture of cold military discipline and the raw shock of a man who had just seen a miracle performed by someone he had dismissed. 44 men, the colonel said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the wind. They just crossed the perimeter wire. Every single one of them is breathing because you broke every regulation in the book. Gray wiped a smear of grease and blood from her forehead, her hand trembling, not from fear, but from the sudden, crushing absence of the vibrations she had been fighting for the last hour. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a mechanic who had pushed a tool past its breaking point and now had to face the bill. What is the price of a life saved? Is it measured in medals or in the quiet, irreversible change in the person who did the saving? The weight of the salute isn't about pride. It's about the gravity of choice. As Gray walked past the colonel toward the hangar, she felt the eyes of the entire base on her. These were the people who, hours ago, didn't know her name. Now they stood in a silent, impromptu corridor, their grease-stained caps held against their chests, their breath hitching as she passed. There was no cheering. There was only a profound, heavy respect, the kind of silence reserved for those who have walked into the fire and returned with the ash still on their skin. Inside the hangar, Gray stopped at her workbench. Her tools were still laid out exactly as she had left them. She picked up the pneumatic wrench, its weight familiar and grounding. The metal was cold. The internal stake she had been carrying, the need to prove she was more than a rejection letter, had been replaced by a new, hollow realization. She had found her wings, but the cost was the anonymity she had used as a shield. She was no longer just a mechanic. She was Grease One, a legend that would be whispered in every motor pool from here to the coast. The final transition from soldier to symbol is never easy. 6 months later, the dust of Outpost Zero was 1,000 miles away, replaced by the sterile, manicured lawns of a training facility. Gray stood before a fresh class of recruits, her new flight wings catching the morning light. She didn't talk to them about aerodynamics or tactical maneuvers. She looked at their clean uniforms and their eager, unburdened eyes, and she reached into her pocket. She pulled out the small, crinkled photograph, now taped together and housed in a protective sleeve. She didn't show them the man in the photo. She showed them the grease stains on the edges. "The manual will tell you how to fly," Gray told the recruits, her voice resonant and grave. "But the machine will tell you if you're worthy. Most of you think you're here to be pilots. You're wrong. You're here to be the soul of the aircraft. And the soul is built in the dirt, not the sky." She looked out at the horizon, where a new formation of Apaches was cresting the ridge, their rotors thumping a rhythm she could feel in her very marrow. She knew the truth now. Failure isn't a rejection. It's a refinement. The sky didn't belong to the people with the best vision. It belonged to the people who refused to look away when the world started to burn. Think about the legacy you leave behind. Is it the rank on your shoulder, or the lives that continue because you dared to be unqualified? As the recruits filed out, one young woman lingered behind. She had grease under her fingernails and a stubborn set to her jaw that reminded Gray of a mirror she had looked into a lifetime ago. The girl didn't ask about the mission or the medals. She looked at Gray's calloused hands and asked a single question that hung in the air like a bated breath. "Does the fear ever go away, ma'am?" Gray looked at the distant silhouettes of the birds in the sky, a faint smile touching the corner of her mouth, the smile of a ghost who had finally found home. "No," Gray whispered, the sound almost lost in the wind. "But eventually, you learn to make it work for you."